I'm Andy Jewell. I hope you can all hear me right now. I'm from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and I'm very pleased to introduce my friend and colleague Melissa Homestead for tonight's event. As you all know, Dr. Homestead is the author of The Only Wonderful Things, the creative partnership of Willa Cather and Edith Lewis, published recently by Oxford University Press. The book is a remarkable accomplishment. It is a beautiful and profound story of the way these two women's lives entwined and enabled the creation of remarkable works of literature. And it's also, I will attest, great fun to read, as Homestead creates a textured and emotional story that follows its characters from Nebraska to Greenwich Village to New Mexico and Grand Manan Island. I can tell you something else about the book too, which may not be as visible to you. It took a great deal of ingenuity, creativity, and perseverance to write. Dr. Homestead and I have been friends and colleagues throughout her years of working on the book, and I've often been in the lucky position of being one of the first people to hear about the latest discovery from her research. Those stories taught me a lot about Edith Lewis and about Willa Cather, but they also taught me that Melissa Homestead is a damn fine researcher, an archival detective who will not be deterred if at first she does not find what she's looking for. And she knows how to turn those discoveries into a powerful and beautifully written story. In researching and writing this book, Dr. Homestead recovered Edith Lewis, a woman who had been overlooked, disrespected, and largely lost, someone who gave a great deal of herself so that American literature and the lives of readers would be richer. It is one of the most important books about Willa Cather's life to come out in decades, and that's because it restores the centrality of Cather's life partner. I first met Melissa Homestead in 2003 when I was a graduate student, and we both attended a Cather conference in Vermont. She was very kind to me at that first meeting, kinder than I really deserved, and I was very excited a few years later when she became my colleague at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she now serves as professor of English, program faculty in Women and Gender Studies, and director of the Willa Cather Project. And over the last several years, we've been working closely together on the complete letters of Willa Cather, a free digital edition of all the writer's surviving correspondence. Dr. Homestead brings her incredible skills and high standards to that project, as she does with every one of her projects. And let me tell you, her publication list is long, and it covers a wide range of American women writers. I know I'm very privileged to be working with Melissa Homestead, and I know all of you are fortunate to be here this evening to hear about her new book. Please welcome Melissa Homestead.
Good evening, everyone. I'm happy to be presenting virtually in this webinar sponsored by the New York Society Library from my kitchen table in Lincoln, Nebraska, although I'd rather be in New York City. My talk will consist of two parts. First, I'll present a brief overview of my book, chapter by chapter, accompanied by images. Then I'm going to return to focus on key scenes from Willa Cather and Edith Lewis's time spent together in New York City. As you'll learn from my chapter overview, 3 chapters of my book are located elsewhere: Lewis's Nebraska childhood, and 2 chapters focusing on Cather and Lewis's travels outside of New York. This is, nevertheless, very much a New York story, and one in which Edith Lewis's place as Cather's equal in a lived partnership has not received adequate recognition. As I explained in my introduction, in much of my book, I put Willa Cather inside Edith Lewis's world rather than vice versa, and my selected readings from my book about the 2 women in New York City reflect this emphasis. I will just also say here, because there might be some disturbances as I read, I've got 1 cat on my lap. This is John. He's settling into shed, and I have 3 others, and they sometimes parade across my virtual book events. But let me get my slides queued up here. There are 2 strands of argument throughout my book, signaled in my title by the phrase creative partnership. First, that as 2 ambitious career women, Cather and Lewis created a romantic and domestic partnership that allowed them to enjoy love and intimacy and to pursue their ambitions. Second, that as an editor, Lewis was a partner in Cather's creative process and also used her expertise in advertising to help craft Cather's image as an author. And this is a page from The Professor's House, and all of the handwriting is Edith Lewis's. My book starts and ends at the old burying ground in Jaffrey, New Hampshire, where Cather and Lewis are buried side by side. I hope that by the end of the book, I've succeeded in undoing the mythology about the gravesite that has obscured Lewis's place in Cather's life. Having started at the end with my own first visit to Jaffrey in the autumn of 1984, I turned the clock back, introducing Edith Lewis as the young woman Willa Cather first met in Lincoln, Nebraska in August 1903 at the home of Sarah Harris, publisher of the Lincoln Courier. This is the Harris house where they met. Neither of the people there is Sarah Harris. It's her mother and her brother, I believe. But this building is still standing, and this is exactly 1903 when they met, is when this picture was taken. Delving briefly into Lewis's New England family history, which stretches as far back as the Mayflower, I paint a picture of her family life in Nebraska before she herself emerged in public view as an adolescent, studying at the university and publishing short stories in the Lincoln Courier. This is her with her sorority at the university in the lower right. She transferred to Smith College, where she met Oxa Barlow, who's an important character in the book, and this is Oxa, and from which she graduated in 1902. She's in the back row here with her literary society in the yearbook. Chapter 2 follows Lewis to New York City, where she moved after teaching school in Lincoln for a year. And I'll talk more about this picture later. And I trace the growth of her relationship with Cather, both personal and professional, from their first meeting in 1903 through about 1918 in this first chapter. From 1906, both Cather and Lewis worked at McClure's magazine, and I argue that the magazine office was the crucible of their collaborative work on Cather's fiction. This is a poem actually published in McClure's, and Edith Lewis edited Cather as a contributor. Cather was on leave from the magazine at this point. I also argue that Cather and Lewis, in choosing to make a home together in 1908, were emulating Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Fields, identified by most scholars, one picture ahead here, identified by most scholars as the prototypical Boston marriage. And Cather met Jewett in 1908 in Boston when she was on assignment for McClure's. That's her on the left, and Annie Fields was her partner on the right. And this picture, again, I'll return to it later, is the building where they moved, Cather and Lewis, in 1908. In any event, after Cather left McClure's, Lewis moved on to Every Week magazine, and this gives you a good idea of what kind of magazine it was, as the managing editor, and I recover Lewis's work as an editor of fiction there, and see that as in dialogue with Cather's work at the same time. So here we have an illustration from Mine to Nia. It's W.T. Benda's illustration of Lena Lingard knitting out in a field while tending her family's cattle. And then we have a story that Edith Lewis commissioned for Every Week magazine, also edited by W.T. Benda. And they clearly were working with Benda at the same time on illustrations of Nebraska farm women, because it's the same model wearing the same clothes, clearly at the same time. In chapter 3, I turn the clock back to 1915 to tell the story of Cather and Lewis's forward shared trips to the U.S. Southwest. Here they are in 1915 at Cliff Palace at Mesa Verde National Park. Throughout the book, Lewis's editing of Cather's fiction is a key theme. Here's the professor's house again. But I linger over the evidence in this chapter because the first surviving edited typescript of one of Cather's novels is the professor's house, which was grounded in their 1915 and 1916 Southwestern trips. And this is actually a map that Edith Lewis drew in 1915 on that trip. Their Southwestern travels in 1925 and 1926 inspired Death Comes for the Archbishop. Here they are in 1925 on horseback. Although there is no typed draft, there's a rich record of their travel and literary collaboration. After mining the record of their experiences together in the desert Southwest, I focus in chapter 4 on Lewis's career as an advertising copywriter at the J. Walter Thompson Company, which of course is in New York, arguing that her advertising copy for soap and hand lotion and Cather's fiction are in conversation with one another. In fact, this is a Willa Cather story, Uncle Valentine, serialized in 2 parts in the Woman's Home Companion in 1925, and an advertisement for Jergens lotion that Edith Lewis wrote that appeared right beside Cather's story. That's called ad stripping, where you put advertisements next to the later part of a story. I also hypothesize that Lewis was behind the famous Edward Steichen photograph of Cather published in Vanity Fair in 1927. Lewis worked extensively with Steichen on advertising campaigns. The previous picture you saw this in here also is one of hands kneading dough for Jergens lotion, and you can see Steichen is the name under one and Steichen's the name under the other. Lewis started in advertising in 1919, and she and Cather first summered on Grand Manan in 1922. And these are the pictures which are sort of blurred and photoshopped together on the cover of the book, which were taken on Grand Manan then. I devote a separate chapter to their many summers there, both before and after they built their own cottage at Whale Cove. Cather's been portrayed as living in isolation on the island, but she was living with Lewis, who was the legal owner of the land and the cottage. Furthermore, at Whale Cove, they were part of a community of women, and only women. In this chapter, I focus on both their collaborative work on stories collected in the volume Obscure Destinies, and this is actually their house. Edith Lewis tinted it with watercolors. It's a photograph, and then Willa Cather wrote at the top, "This is our little home." But this is where they were working on the stories in Obscure Destinies, published in 1932. And here we have an image of Edith Lewis editing Two Friends, which is one of those stories. And it's also about how both of them responded to the deaths of their parents. I also see them as moving past grief in the 1930s by inviting sisters and nieces to visit them on the island. And this is Willa Cather's niece, Mary Virginia Auld, who summered on the island with them twice in 1932 and 1933. In my last full chapter, I take them back to New York City. This is a modern real estate website picture, where they settled into a large apartment at 570 Park Avenue in 1932. In 1927, they had lost their Greenwich Village apartment to subway construction and camped out in an apartment hotel for 5 years before leasing another apartment. They made their lives together there and built relationships with each other's families and with the Menuhin family. So that's Yehudi Menuhin, the violinist, the most famous member, but also his sisters, Hepzibah and Yalta, who were musicians, and their parents. Both Cather and Lewis also died in this apartment 25 years apart. Appropriately, Lewis's profound grief at Cather's death occupies a significant portion of this final chapter. The years after Cather's 1947 death correspond to the Cold War of panic over homosexuality, called by one historian the Lavender Scare. In my epilogue, I consider how this context enabled some to deny Cather's lesbian sexuality and to refuse to see Lewis for what she was and what she had been in Cather's life. So this is the part where I'm going to turn back and go back to some of the New York scenes and places that are important in the book, starting in chapter 2. And I will get my book open here. So this is about when Edith Lewis moved to New York City in 1903, and when Willa Cather visited her there, and some of the things that happened. So Lewis moved there in 1903, and as I say here now, by 1904, Lewis had rented a room at 60 Washington Square. And so here we have, of course, Washington Square, and this is looking from the north side to the south side, and I'll say a little more in a minute. Greenwich Village had not yet become the capital of New York and American bohemian life. Indeed, the neighborhood was still referred to as Washington Square rather than Greenwich Village. However, the southern side of the square, so we're looking towards the southern side, was a bohemian district and had been since the early 1860s, when the first Americans to embrace the ideal of la vie bohème began meeting at Pfaff's Saloon on Broadway, a block from the southeast corner of Washington Square. Large houses occupied by wealthy families and their servants still predominated on the north side, but by the late 19th century, similar houses on the opposite side of the square had become boarding and lodging houses, catering to artistic types of modest means. And you can actually see part of the road that we'll see in the next picture through the arch here. And here we go back to that picture you saw before. 60 Washington Square, which is the one with the round lintel over the door on the left, was a 4-story building near the intersection of 4th, the southern boundary of the square, and Thompson Streets, perpendicular to 4th. Lewis's building was part of a group of houses later christened Genius Row, because many painters and writers lived and worked in them. On the corner were stores and ramshackle 2-story wooden buildings, rare survivals of an earlier era, and horse cars ran on tracks on both 4th and Thompson. Occupants of the cheap lodging houses on the south side of the square could hear the clanging of the cinder-spewing elevated train running on Amity Street behind them. And you can sort of vaguely see the structure of the elevated line in the back there. So then I say a few words about some of the people that Edith Lewis knew from her Smith College classmates who were in New York City, including Oxa Barlow, who you saw before, and another young woman, Abby Merchant, who she also knew in college. Willa Cather had been to New York City only twice before she met Lewis. She spent a week in Manhattan in February 1898, taking in the theater, and in April 1903, S.S. McClure summoned her to the city to talk about short stories she had submitted to his magazine. At their meeting, McClure promised to publish The Troll Garden, her collection of stories about art and artists, and to place the stories in magazines before the book came out. In the spring of 1904, however, when Cather was trying to finish The Troll Garden and was working on Fanny, a never-published Pittsburgh novel, she complained to Dorothy Canfield, whom she had befriended when she was a student at the University of Nebraska, and Canfield's father was the university chancellor, that her teaching duties were interfering with her writing and she needed a break. My present plan, she explained to Canfield, is to spend the summer in New York, down near or with Edith Lewis in Washington Square. Lewis and Canfield knew each other as children in Lincoln. She has been a regular trump about looking up rooms for me and such things. I want to get off somewhere and make a final struggle with this accursed and underdone novel. And New York seems a good place to do it. Describing herself as having gotten into a rut, she wrote, "I think Miss Lewis would be a good pilot for me. She's all wrapped up in her discoveries in local color." When Cather visited Lewis on Washington Square, right there at 60, in July and August of 1904, she entered her young friend's world and was observed critically. Barlow and Lewis alternated Sunday visits to one another's lodgings, and Barlow later recalled the two of them hanging over the banister at 60 Washington Square to watch Cather depart for a dinner party wearing a satin gown and an opera cloak. Abby Merchant, who lived in 60 Washington Square, reading Willa Cather Living half a century later, praised Lewis's beautiful, clear, warm picture of Cather as I knew her, which awakened an almost physically painful nostalgia for the Washington Square days. Cather and Lewis certainly took in the city together, but both were also working. Lewis daily at the Century Company offices, and this is actually a rare survival. The building is still on Union Square, where Edith Lewis walked from Washington Square to Union Square to work. And she was a proofreader on the Century Dictionary at the Century Company. Lewis daily at the Century Company offices and Cather at 60 Washington Square. The Troll Garden was scheduled for publication by McClure, Phillips & Co. in late 1904 or early 1905. In Lewis's Bohemia story, this is a story she published as a teenager in the paper in Lincoln, artists are happy and carefree, but Cather's artist's tales were dark and grim. And I say a little here about the sculptor's funeral and Paul's case. Lewis read Cather's work in progress in 1904 and took one of these stories to the office to show an officer of the company whom I knew, but he regretfully, though kindly, declined it, saying for the Century magazine, they preferred stories about equally combining humor and pathos. So next I am going to go on to 1908. When Cather and Lewis had, let's see, wait a second. I'm trying to balance too many things on a small table here. Let me make sure that I get the right thing here. 65, and then we go to 82. So this is when Cather and Lewis are going to move to Washington Place together and take an apartment. And this is the apartment building. Even though Cather continued to write in Pittsburgh and travel with McClung, she was about to begin in earnest her work as managing editor at National Magazine, and she chose to make a home in New York City with her fellow magazine worker. Cather officially assumed her post in September 1908. The magazine's finances were still shaky. McClure considered Cather and staff writer George Kibbe Turner essential, and he urged a director of the magazine to offer them year-long contracts starting October 1st so that they could sign apartment leases. With Cather's employment secure for a year, she and Lewis began a new chapter in their relationship, signing a lease for an apartment at 82 Washington Place. a modern 6-story apartment building just off Washington Square. And here you can see they published a directory of apartment buildings, and the rent for the smallest apartment was $600 a year, so about $50 a month. Shortly after the two women signed their lease, Cather returned to Boston on magazine business. Her trip also allowed her to spend 2 beautiful blue and gold days with Fields and Jewett, so that's Andy Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, at Thunderbolt Hill, Fields' house at Manchester by the Sea. A telegram called Cather back to New York, where the office was a good deal too tense and strained just now to be agreeable, making it hard to do one's work well with this kind of uncertainty. Cather longed to return to Thunderbolt Hill, but she also pointedly described herself to Fields as writing while sitting in the little apartment in which you took such a kindly interest. So this is the new apartment on Washington Place. No longer renting a room in a shabby rooming house, Cather was sharing a furnished apartment with Lewis. Some of the wallpaper is too bright and some of it too dark, Cather wrote to Fields, but it's all brand new and clean. Implicitly placing herself and Lewis together both at the office and at their apartment, Cather further complained that some of the furniture was distinctly ludicrous, but then it is well enough to have certain pretexts for dull wit about, especially when the days at the office are long and discouraging as they are now. And I just imagine the two of them coming back to the apartment and being like, oh my God, this armoire is ridiculous, because they've just had a bad day at the office. Writing to Jewett later in October, Cather described her increasing pleasure in the shared adventure of apartment life and days at the office with Lewis. She says, Miss Lewis and I are enjoying our apartment more every day, although we lead no dreamy, idle lives in it. Mrs. Fields, I know, will exclaim when you tell her so far we have largely fended for ourselves and have managed to get our own breakfast and lunch in, and about 3 days a week our dinner. We dine at the Brevoort, so this is the hotel in Greenwich Village, the Brevoort, which had a cafe, on other nights, and have a maid come to clean 2 days a week. There are good reasons why we should each of us practice reasonable economy this winter, and cooking does take one's mind away from office troubles. These latter cares will, we hope, be somewhat lighter after the middle of November. Meanwhile, we shall have a pretty thorny path to tread until then. The sales for October were 10,000 more copies than last October, and November has started well. In this letter, Cather insistently drew parallels between the long-established Jewett-Fields menage and her own newly established one with Lewis. She also dropped into the first-person plural, making herself and Lewis both unit at home, we cook, and the McClure's office. We cook together to keep our minds off troubles at the office. Cather expected Jewett to report to her partner in Boston about Cather's economical apartment living with her partner in New York, so different from Fields's large townhouse on Charles Street and her grand summer cottage at Manchester by the Sea, both staffed by many servants. So the next place that they move is to an apartment at 5 Bank Street. And one of the great tragedies of Cather biography is that there are no pictures of Bank Street at the relevant time where you can see 5 Bank Street, which was torn down in 1927. And I'll refer to that later. So for now, I'll just put up a sort of period map and the historic plaque that go at Bank Street. And Cather had been away for about a year, and Edith Lewis went back to 60 Washington Square while Cather was moving around and traveling. When Cather returned to New York in August 1912, she spent 2 very busy weeks making satisfactory arrangements for paid writing commissions. Cameron Mackenzie, the managing editor at McClure's, had promised to pay her $300 apiece for a series of nonfiction articles on theater, opera, and dance. From New York, she went to Pittsburgh to work on her new Swedish story, which would become part of her second published novel, O Pioneers. Continuing her frantic movement, she traveled twice to New York from Pittsburgh in late September, first to sign a lease for the apartment Lewis had found for them, and then to move her effects into it. Cather boasted to Elizabeth Sargent that it was the perfect apartment, large, old-fashioned, roomy, 1 flight up, good fireplace, good windows, good woodwork, wide stairs up. Lewis was relieved by the change from the box-like Washington Place apartment, and the rent was even cheaper, only $42 a month. However, they had to do without modern comforts they had enjoyed at Washington Place to get so much space for so little. The apartment had gas rather than electric lights and was heated primarily by coal. Although far enough from Washington Square to be quiet, 5 Bank Street was still in Bohemian Greenwich Village, and Lewis could still walk to work on Union Square. Honoring their new home, Cather gave Lewis a translation of the Journal of Francois Krasinska, great-grandmother of Victor Emmanuel. Cather was not yet ready, however, to commit to writing in their new apartment, so she quickly returned to Pittsburgh to work. So there is a moment, though, when Cather pretty much stops going to Pittsburgh all the time and really settles into the apartment at 5 Bank Street. And this is what I'm going to talk about here now. So although Cather and Lewis had been leasing apartments together for 5 years, this is 1913, Cather did not slow down her constant movement between Pittsburgh and New York and truly settle into life with Lewis at 5 Bank Street until late 1913. On Christmas Eve, the two women went to see Cather's new friend, Olive Fremstad, perform as Isolde in Richard Wagner's Tristan and Isolde at the Metropolitan Opera, and here she is in that role. They had seen Fremstad perform many times before, but researching her essay, 3 American Singers, Louise Homer, Geraldine Farrar, Olive Fremstad, just out in McClure's magazine, had given Cather the opportunity to get to know the diva personally. Cather had finally had most of her books shipped from the McClung house in Pittsburgh to 5 Bank Street. To swell the glory of this apartment, which I like better and better, she explained to her sister Elsie. She rebuffed, however, her sister's suggestion that she might find a teaching position in New York and share in that swollen glory. So Elsie had graduated from Smith College in 1912. She explained, "I'm afraid our apartment is not built for 3. The boxes of books had piled mountain high in the dining room in their boxes for a week, when on Christmas Day, she and Lewis tackled them like soldiers in battle, not stopping until they were done at nightfall. Dressed in their oldest clothes, they went at 5:30 to Guffanti's Table d'Hôte, an Italian restaurant in Midtown. So this is cheap Bohemian food, hoping that no one would see them, and then went to bed early after getting soaked in a rainstorm. On New Year's Eve, they boarded a train for Boston together, Lewis to visit her family for a few weeks, and Cather to visit Margaret Deland and Annie Fields. Now I'm going to talk a little about one of the sort of most famous aspects of, well, it's always portrayed as Cather's time at 5 Bank Street, but it's 2 people here, right? Which is that they had Friday afternoon tea where all sorts of people dropped in. Cather and Lewis began holding their legendary teas at 5 Bank Street the same year Lewis started as managing editor at Every Week magazine, which is to say 1915. These teas have generally been portrayed as a salon with Cather, the novelist, at their center, but they also gave Lewis a place to mentor her young staff at the magazine. As Brenda Euland recalled, even though Bruce Barton was the public face of Every Week, he was the editor-in-chief, Lewis was our real boss. Euland wrote her mother that she and Lewis have a secret liking of each other. She is pretty and shy, and we both have the same trouble of jerky talking. Strange to say for me, I love her. Euland remembered her as the best boss I ever had, the most intelligent, the most kind, the most just, and the bluntest. Lewis would criticize Euland's work, writing humorous captions for photographs that they published in sort of big spreads in the magazine, while almost lisping and blushing deeply. Her criticism would have caused an unbearable wound, delivered by anyone else, but Euland respected Lewis so much that she wrote her captions without complaining, feeling grateful to her for all her guidance. Euland felt like a young nobody at Friday tea when music critics like Louis Sherwin and Pitt Sanborn were engaging in highbrow talk. While Cather, who was affirmative and masculinely intellectual, her talk pleasant and fluid, but very definite. Lewis, however, our darling, as she, Anne Harrington, and John Chapin Mosher saw her, and those are 2 other staff members that worked under Lewis. Lewis was always shy and quiet, gently blushing if you said something that made her laugh. And she just quietly saw to it that we had a nice time and that there was hot water for tea. Gossiping at tea, Herondine reported that Lewis had once written beautiful poetry, but gave it up. They all agreed, I bet she would be 100 times better than Miss Cather. This is just another one of my favorite little scenes of New York life from their times at Bank Street during World War I, towards the end of the war. A war-related coal famine and a blizzard in early 1918 landed a 1-2 punch on both apartment and office life for Cather and Lewis. Because their gas lines froze, they couldn't cook. And Cather wrote at the dining room table to be near a coal grate and spent all her time hunting coal to feed it. Meanwhile, every week's office was almost entirely without heat, and as Cather reported to friends in Red Cloud, Edith's office was so cold she had to work in her coat and furs for weeks. Nevertheless, every Friday afternoon they had pleasant and interesting people for tea, including many friends from Lincoln who came through New York, and they pulled off some jolly little dinner parties. So now we're going to jump ahead to they're losing the apartment and moving to Park Avenue. But first, we're going to stop where they did at the Grossmanner Hotel, which was in Greenwich Village. In 1932, the two women could well afford to leave the Grossmanner Hotel in Greenwich Village for a Park Avenue apartment. 5 years earlier, when they were leaving Bank Street because of the subway construction, Cather suggested that her next step would be to get away from New York altogether. And she continued to grumble about the city during their years at the Grossmanner. However, Lewis made no move to give up her New York-based job. And if Cather wanted to continue to live with Lewis, she had to live in the city. In 1932, both women's parents were dead. They died 1926 to 1931. Each of them lost their parents in turn. Both of their parents were dead, so neither Cather nor Lewis was making regular visits to aging or dying parents. Cather had been going across the country. Lewis had been going up and down to Massachusetts. And Lewis's job at Thompson was secure, even though it wasn't clear for a while that it would be because they got rid of so much staff at the advertising agency during the Great Depression. There was then no longer any reason to delay renting an apartment. When Cather and Lewis each moved to Greenwich Village in the first decade of the century, it suited their life stages and their pocketbooks. Before 1913, northbound trains heading out of the city ran above ground in a perilous smoky tunnel occupying the land that later became a broad avenue, Park Avenue. And this is when they were beginning the construction to remedy that. The opening of a new terminal that could serve electric trains made the desirable land east of Central Park available for development. And that, of course, is the Grand Central Terminal. 570 Park Avenue, and this is a period photograph, which doesn't give you a very good sense of it, but I wanted to have at least one period photograph. 570 Park Avenue, a 16-story Georgian-style building designed by architect Emery Roth, was completed in 1916. Taking a large apartment in this elevator building suited Cather and Lewis as financially secure middle-aged women. Although the Greenwich Village landlord had multiplied their rent so many times that their new rent was lower than the Bank Street rent had been when they left. They were next to Central Park, where they enjoyed walking, and the building was just a mile from the Gray Bar building, adjacent to Grand Central, where the Thompson Agency had relocated in the 1920s. Lewis's commute to work was a mile-long stroll straight down Park Avenue. So on the left, you can see, and this is about the time that she would have been doing this, there's kind of still a median in Park Avenue, and you're going towards Grand Central where it kind of ends, and the Gray Bar building is off to the side there, but then you can see the Gray Bar building head on in the image on the right, and that's where she was going. Cather explained to Mabel Lujan in late 1932, when they were just settling into the apartment, that Lewis was desperately busy at the office, leaving most of the tasks associated with moving into the apartment to Cather, who, if she shopped for more than a few hours at a time, bought the most absurd things. Apologizing for the fact that Lewis had not written Lujan in so long, Cather complained that holding an important business job in New York these days means working like the Fury. I hope she'll resign soon. Lewis showed no willingness to do so, however. Ooh, I guess let's go back here now. Lewis and Cather's, oh, that's what I wanted to do. Go back here. Lewis and Cather's new apartment was large. It's 1,800 square feet. Everybody's salivating for that now, yes. Encompassed 3 bedrooms, 2 very large, 1 small, 2 bathrooms, a kitchen, a butler's pantry, a large living room, and a separate dining room. Familiar objects from Bank Street were unpacked and displayed after 5 years in storage. An engraving of George Sand, a bust of John Keats that Annie Fields had bequeathed to Cather, and paintings by Oxa and Earl Brewster. So that's Lewis's college roommate and her husband. Elizabeth Sargent found the size of the living room intimidating, large enough to be called a drawing room, and the apartment as a whole dark and cheerless because the living room windows face the Colony Club next door. So they were actually kind of on the back, and the Colony Club would be to the sort of left and behind in this photograph. Cather, however, liked the absence of Park Avenue traffic noise. Some of Cather and Lewis's friends had also migrated to Park Avenue at this point. So 570 is between 62nd and 63rd, and Albert Donovan, Cather's student at Pittsburgh, and by the 1930s, a New York accountant, shared an apartment at 52 East 64th Street with Hugh Clark. Lewis's friend John Mosher, he worked it every week, and at this point he was the film critic at the New Yorker. And his partner, Philip Claflin, a Harvard-educated broker, lived at 136 East 64th. In the late 1930s, Mosher and Claflin also acquired a cottage at Cherry Grove on Fire Island. Moving to 570 also put Cather and Lewis close to one of their favorite restaurants, the elegant French restaurant Voisin, which was located on Park Avenue halfway between 570 and Grand Central. And so it was in the Montana, which is the building there on the right, which is in the 300 range on Park Avenue. And there's the menu. Having her own financial resources, Lewis treated Mosher and Brenda Euland, who I mentioned before, another former Every Week staff member, to lunch there in 1935. Euland was divorced, raising her daughter alone in Connecticut and struggling to make her way as an author. Euland wrote to Bruce Barton, who had been editor at Every Week, about the lunch. I saw darling Edith Lewis. She took me and John Mosher to lunch at Voisin, and we drank too much, and I can remember that through the fog, John Mosher rebuked me, saying that no one anymore talked the way I did about truth and love. But Edith Lewis stuck up for me. She looked so elegant, charming, like Countess Mendel. Elsie de Wolfe, Lady Mendel was a fashionable New York interior decorator who, like Lewis, did not color her striking silver gray bob. I love that, Edith Lewis, Euland concluded. So that's the conclusion of my reading from the book, and I think we have time for questions.
I'm Sarah Holiday from the library staff, and I'm just going to join you on screen here, if that's okay, and kind of share with everybody the questions that come in the chat and a few things to further the conversation. Thank you, audience members, for joining us. Do feel free to pop your questions in the chat on the right side of the screen. So if this sounds good, I have a couple of interesting things, fascinating talk, and we're really, for me, this is in part building on an exhibition that we had at the New York Society Library a few years ago, where I learned a lot more about Willa Cather and her life and career than I'd known before. Hello, Robert Thacker, who asked, thank you for your very compelling, hi, Bob. Thank you for your very compelling talk. Can you address in a little more detail Lewis's influence on Cather's writing?
Well, Lewis edited Cather's writing. The first known typescript is The Professor's House, but it's pretty clear from that typescript that Lewis had been doing this for some time already. So she was digging in, and Cather was accepting quite substantial editorial intervention. A lot of what she was doing was really focusing, slimming down, instead of long and baggy sentences, getting sort of lean and elegant sentences. She often removed a lot of internal commentary, too much going on in characters' heads, and she sort of pared down and left it suggestive. And she also, really, she was writing advertising copy by the 1920s and continued to do so through the 1940s. So she was really working, I think, in the way that she would with advertising copy to just really pare it down, because in advertising, they would say, words cost money because of space rates. And Cather actually has a character in the professor's house. Well, it's Godfrey St. Peter, the title character, thinks at one point when he's editing the diary of Tom Outland, who's the character who's died in the past, right? And he's editing this diary, and it says, it's all the things that Tom didn't say that make it so beautiful, basically, if words had cost money. So you get that kind of crossover, I think, between the two. And of course, Lewis is also bringing a literary sensibility because she had written and published fiction when she was young, and had been editing Cather's work, I think, before she started advertising copywriting. So it sort of goes in the other direction, too.
So it's really a pretty substantial influence, and more than we realize. In the chat, we have the comment that these questions are actually from Harriet. Thank you. And what would Cather have been as a writer without Lewis?
That's a question I asked in my introduction. I think she would have still been a writer, but I think a lot of her style, I think, is a product of collaboration. So I think she had the urge to write. She might have had other editorial intervention from somebody else. But it's also true that a lot of the experiences that she had that were translated into fiction were experiences that she had with Lewis, and that she might not have had in the same way if she hadn't been traveling with her and living with her.
So both Cather and Lewis were professionals. And of course, the stereotype, anyway, that most hetero couples through this period would have had one working partner and one who didn't work outside the home. Do you think the equality with both partners having careers is more common in same-sex couples in this period, or is there not enough sample size to offer?
I've had a number of people try to say, well, aren't they just like Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas? And that was a relationship where there was more of that distribution of the public facing, the professional versus the domestic and the social. But for Cather and Lewis, no, not at all. And there are many people who will still, think that Edith Lewis was Willa Cather's secretary, and she was too busy. She had a secretary at work. So no disrespect to secretaries. Secretaries do very important work. And Sarah Bloom, who was Cather's secretary working part-time, is an important part of the process for Cather too. But if anything, the complaints, like that one quotation I had from Mabel Lujan, in a letter to Mabel Lujan, she wants Edith Lewis to quit. The 1930s, paradoxically, in the Great Depression, that's when Cather's making a lot of money. And she could have afforded to just support Lewis, but Lewis didn't want to. And it's really ironic too, because in the 1920s, Lewis is writing all about, like, you can bathe a baby and make cakes and still have beautiful hands. And she wasn't doing any of that. That's even funny on her job application for the J. Walter Thompson Company. Like, what are her hobbies? I think she said like children and housework or something, which is just nonsense. Because, she loved her nieces, but they hadn't been born yet. And I think she was telling them what they kind of wanted to hear. But, Cather, whenever they don't have a maid, Cather is writing and complaining about how she's doing the housework because Edith is working too, her hours are so long. Work days were 6 weeks back then, right? You had a half day on Saturday was part of the regular work week. So yeah, it's, if anything, Edith Lewis has the higher time commitment and, job, that her work life is more demanding than Willa Cather's, because Willa Cather just like wrote a few hours in the morning and then went for walks and other things.
It's really progressive in so many ways. I mean, just Lewis's career aspirations is fantastic. Question here: did Lewis influence Cather's earlier books, such as "O Pioneers," "My Antonia," and "Song of the Lark"?
Don't really have the documents to say so. I mean, I think the example that I gave in my presentation of Lewis and Cather both working with W.T. Benda on illustrations at the same time. I mean, there's some sense that they are certainly they're having conversations. I can't imagine that Cather was working on that novel and did not talk to Edith Lewis. I know that Edith Lewis read proofs for that novel after she lost her job, and every week went up to Jaffrey with Cather, but just don't have the documents. But there are other things too that you can see, like there's, Olive Fremstad's life gets repurposed in Every Week magazine after Edith Lewis has read the proofs for Song of the Lark with Cather. She did read the proofs for that as well. So I assume so, but just don't have the paper.
So a question in the chat, can you talk a little more about all of the research involved in writing your book? Obviously, this has been a massive project.
Yeah, 18 years. Yeah. I mean, it was a very long process, and there's no body of correspondence between the two women that's extant. There's one letter and 5 postcards. When I started, there was 1 letter and 2 postcards. So there could be more things that will get into collections. It's a complicated story potentially there. But even then, you don't write letters to somebody who's sitting across the living room. So that wouldn't necessarily answer your question. But I still actually have very few of Edith Lewis's letters to anybody while Cather was still alive. So I had to be creative, and I just had to keep throwing myself at it from every possible angle and thinking creatively about sources. And more materials kept coming into collections. So for example, Lewis's college roommate and her husband, their letters to her kept coming in to one collection at UNL and another. And I started to realize you could infer what she wrote to them from their responses to her, and use that as a basis. So, and then I used, newspapers, census records, corporate archives, the J. Walter Thompson archives, a lot of stuff in there. That's how I reconstructed her advertising career. So yeah, a lot of different sources. And then of course, for the works where there are edited typescripts, then you have stories to tell about that process, and a lot to figure out, when was this document typed? When did Edith Lewis pick it up to edit it? And so all of those things then, became part of sorting into a story, a lot of the sorting being about chronology, right? So there are, single space chronologies that are as long as the chapters that I used to build the chapters.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful, and particularly the depth of archival research and the fact that things are still coming to light. That's remarkable. A little follow-up. So the publisher didn't always keep the proofs, or were these not proofs that went to a publisher?
Oh, so proofs. Okay, so there's galley proofs, there's page proofs. It seems there are some proofs that are extant, some that are corrected, some that are the uncorrected proofs at the professor's house just showed up a couple of years ago. A collector had bought them many years before and donated them to Smith College. So the proofs, one of the things I did figure out from the proofs that do exist, Cather left Houghton Mifflin, her original publisher, in part because they were charging her a lot for proofs for corrections in the proof stage. She kept revising. And Knopf let her make corrections on proofs, and didn't charge her. And one of the things that I realized was that the corrections on proofs were in her handwriting, not Edith Lewis's, which tells me that Edith Lewis was reading the proofs and Willa Cather was making corrections on the proofs. So, so when Willa Cather was hearing her work in its near final form, it was Edith Lewis's voice that she heard. And you can track that pretty substantially. And that's very consequential for the professor's house. That was one of my favorite things to figure out and write, is the little thing about reading page proofs for the professor's house. So
that's beautiful. A comment over here is fascinating. Absolutely.
Geeky fascination, yeah.
Well, we're all bookish people around here. Do you think that there's a character in Cather's work who resembles Lewis? Did she use Lewis as a model for anybody?
I think that the place that you can see that is in the Southwestern fiction, where their experiences are transformed into the experiences of men. But you can see their experiences at Mesa Verde National Park in Tom Outland's story in The Professor's House. And also, I think in The Professor's House, Godfrey St. Peter is editing Tom's diaries. So there's Edith Lewis, in a sense. I think that's kind of a little inside joke to have Edith Lewis there editing, but she's also edited the novel. So I think not in any quite straightforward way. I would say that it's more the experiences. Cather actually does write a bunch of stories about New York office workers that nobody ever talks about, that were published in the 19-teens. And there's one story set in a magazine, Ardessa is that story. And people say it's about McClure's, but I actually think it also was maybe kind of about Every Week magazine, where Edith Lewis was working. But I don't think she's one of the characters so much.
So I think we can do one or two more questions if anybody has anything else to toss into the chat. I just want to ask somewhat self-serving from the library's point of view. First of all, random note, I was struck that you mentioned the 1918 coal shortage, because that also affected the New York Society Library, which was at University Place and 12th Street at that time. And that was actually our last longish closing was during that coal shortage prior to 2020, obviously. But because of the same reason, I assume, because it was cold in there. But of course, Willa Cather and Edith Lewis were members of the Society Library for 20 years or more than that, or at least during Cather's lifetime. I think Lewis may have continued it after that.
She did, but you didn't keep her borrowing records.
That's right.
I asked about that. After Willa Cather died, you just pitched those.
Yeah, that was bad choice on if only we'd realized. But you did use our charging cards or their charging cards at our library to look at their reading. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned from those?
Well, there was, and a lot, those charge cards have been used to talk about Cather's research for Saphira and the Slave Girl, her last published novel. They didn't really inform anything that I had to say in the they start in the late 1930s, because it's actually Edith Lewis's charge card and Willa Cather. That's the way the card is structured. But it's really not clear who was reading what. And so I thought about it. In fact, I recently went back and looked at the copy that I was sent several years ago when I was looking to say, do you have the records after Willa Cather died? And I said, no, I don't. But I know one of the things that Edith Lewis was reading, she didn't borrow from the Society Library. She was engaged in an extended course of reading on polar exploration. And none of the books that I know she was reading, because there's actually a little travel diary and there's some letters about her reading. She didn't get them. I think she actually, Valdemar Stefansson, the Icelandic American polar explorer, that Cather and Lewis did some reading, and then they invited him over to dinner, and then Lewis kept on reading, and she helped the widow of a polar explorer try to publish her book. But so I know she was reading a bunch of books, and she didn't charge them out from the Society Library.
I'm sure that's true of many of us. We get things from the public library and we buy them.
Or even, I think actually Valdemar Stefansson lent her copies of the books. So there you go.
Thank you. Can you describe how Lewis shaped Cather's reputation as her literary executor after Cather's death? And this could go along with, did Lewis partner with anyone else after Cather's death?
No, she did not. She lived alone. She had friends. She had some male friends that she made, who I'm pretty sure they were all gay, and they were all Cather devotees. And I think she was an older woman who, having, younger men help her like with luggage and stuff, and to be her friends and companions when she was traveling. I think that that's pretty much what was going on. And also this kind of like mutual devotion to Cather kept Cather's memory alive for her. I could write a whole book on Lewis as literary executor, which nobody wanted that book, so I didn't write it, but I have enough material. I think that she gets criticized and blamed sometimes for perpetuating things like Cather's, false birth year and things. But mostly I think she was trying to carry out Cather's wishes, and had the same kind of interest in prestige that Cather did, the sort of prestige of the reputation, not as much income, more cultural and symbolic capital. But yes, there's a lot of things going on there. But like I said, I could write a whole book on that. But she does also get sort of blamed and mocked and criticized for her work as literary executor by some people, because nobody likes the literary executor.
Yes, common, unfortunately. Someone comments they were struck that Lewis wrote poetry and fiction before becoming an ad writer. To flip an earlier question, what might Lewis have been without Cather?
I think there's been a tendency, and a few people have claimed without much actual knowledge, that Lewis gave up ambition to subordinate herself to Cather. I don't think that's really what it's about. Her family finances and fortunes in Nebraska were just imploding. It was a ridiculous mess. And they sort of fled to Massachusetts because there was just no way they could stay. And I think that a lot of the change really had more to do with practicality. But I think that, I don't know what she might have done if she hadn't met Cather. She might have pursued a similar course, but I think that having the companionship, having that sort of love and intimacy made it easier for her to pursue her ambitions, because she was the sole copywriter on two of the most important accounts of the biggest ad agency in the United States in the 1920s. That's pretty remarkable stuff. And I think it would have been hard to do that without having something in her life outside of the office too, that sustained her.
Quick comment that Cather had a previous significant relationship with Isabel, whose last name I'm afraid I don't know.
McClung, right? McClung, later Hamburg.
And did Cather instruct her correspondence to be destroyed at her death?
No.
Yes. So her correspondence was not with Lewis.
Well, she did destroy her letters to Isabel McClung Hamburg after Jan Hamburg returned the letters to her. There is no evidence that she requested Jan to return those letters. He just did it because I think that's a thing people did. They sent letters to people who had written them after somebody died. And Cather, there are multiple points that suggest she did really destroy those letters. But there is really no evidence of a generalized pattern of destruction. Her will forbids publication and quotation for publication. It does not say her letters have to be destroyed. And if she really wanted to destroy letters during her lifetime, she would have written to people and asked to have the letters returned or asked them to destroy them. There's one other instance, which is very specific that I won't get into, but I have a forthcoming essay that's all about this question, in fact. But, if she'd wanted her family to destroy her letters, anybody, Henry James, we know that Henry James destroyed letters and wanted letters destroyed because he wrote to people saying, destroy these letters, and then they didn't. Nothing like that in the case of Cather. So but I think the mythology, there's, it's been very powerful for trying to do particular things about Cather, to have that as a mythology about her. Another cat here. This is Bob.
So this has been fantastic. I think we might move toward drawing to a close there. If anybody has any final comments or questions they'd like to toss in the chat, feel free to do so. Professor Homestead, is there anything else in general you'd like to add? And of course, I can't help asking, you've spent so long working on this project and it's now come to fruition. Do you have another project in the works, or is it too early to?
Well, it's too early to have any projects involving archival research in the works because all the libraries are still closed. But my next book that I want to write and want to get started on someday is a dual biography of Annie Fields and Sarah Orne Jewett, which would be kind of like a prequel to this one, as it were. So, because I'm just not convinced that anybody really understands that relationship or what people thought of it. And so I want to figure it out.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Melissa Homestead, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you, everybody.